this is the front end tool. This is the one that allows students to collect their dots. So I'll show you the dot plot tool here real quick. You can see our grid with a little bit of explanations and some video instructions on how to do this either on a desktop or a mobile device. And as a student, you would come in here and you would begin, and you would have two pieces of information. You would have your student identification and your school codes. So this student, you can see, has three classes: Heroic Myth, Living with a Secret Identity, and Superpowers and Ethics. And so they are asked to then drag each class onto the grid. So Heroic Myth, I find challenging, but I don't really like it too much, so I drop it there. Living with a Secret Identity isn't particularly difficult, but it's fun and I enjoy it, so I put it there. And Superpowers and Ethics, I really get into those conversations, so I think I love it, and it's extremely challenging. So I've placed my dots, I'm done, and that's the extent of the time it takes a student to give us the feedback. This requires that a student has the ability to conceptualize a two-dimensional axis where they can effectively work with two variables at the same time. We've thought about, as we begin to try and roll this out to even younger students, that we will separate out those two axes and just simply ask them, how much do you love or hate the class you're in, and how hard is it? Let me pop over to the analysis side, if I can type fast enough. Here we go. So once the data, since this is just a live data tool, as soon as you enter those pieces of information, you can visualize it. And so if we go into, and we'll show you our Wellington data because the other data is kind of meaningless. So this is our visualization tool that allows us to see the data. It'll give us quick things like numbers, total numbers in each quadrant, percentage of those results in each quadrant, the average location of all those dots is represented by the big blue dot, and then you get the actual coordinates of that average, so you can see how you average in the x direction, which would be a rating of 40. This is on a 0 to 200 scale in each direction. So we're at a plus 40 here for our love it axis, and we're at a plus 34 from our challenged, unchallenged axis. And so that gives us a way to do some comparisons. So what you're seeing here is overall, this is every single dot for every single class. I love looking at this data because you get to see things like human artifact. You'll notice there's these kind of faint X across the screen where students apparently tend to like to put things sort of equally along that X equals Y line, which I think is kind of interesting. And then you get these really intense locations at the corners where people feel extremely strongly, and so they kind of dump their dots in the corners, which I think is kind of interesting too. And you get this big chunk in the middle where people are sort of undecided, and so put it right in the middle. But then the tool allows us to do some things like average view. This allows us to see, this is a average of that student's dots. So each dot now represents a student's overall opinion of all of their classes as opposed to all of their individual dots. And you can see, obviously, as we average, we get a little bit less variation. If I go back to the overall tool, we now have filters, and we can begin to break things down. For example, by grade, we can pull up our 12th graders and see how they're doing. We have 74% of our 12th grader responses for this particular time period in the engaged quadrant, so we would think that would be particularly good. And here's where we can begin to drill down. We can display identifiers and click, and we now get student identifiers, and so we could come in here and say, okay, let's say student 9201 is particularly challenged. I mean, they've put that all the way at the max and they're not enjoying it. And then we provide a summary view for teachers. So let's see if I put in something like 12.1 these are now teacher reports. This would be a teacher report where you can see your classes here that you're teaching in this top set. You'll see the dot plot for each of your classes. And then to give you some context, that will give you dot plots for those departments. So for example, the social studies classes, you can then compare to the overall results of all social study classes. And as a teacher, I would look here and see social studies 7th section 2 is actually in the grind quadrant.
Mhm.
And so you might wonder, like, as you might think as a teacher, what am I doing differently? Is this the class that's at the end of the day, maybe? What is it that's different here than all of my other experiences and the average in general? And then you also get grade level comparisons. And I'll just go back to home here and